Yeah? Yay. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you guys are joining us for this breakout session. We're going to start today talking about open education and education data. Mike Powell will be our panelist moderator for today. We've got a great panel up ahead. So with that, we'll go ahead and start.
So thank you for being here. We can't see you at all because of these lights. So just if you desperately need to kind of get our attention, do this or say something to us. So really quickly, I'm Mike Powell. I have been with a consulting company that does most of our work in K-12 education since about February. Prior to that, I spent 2.5 years in the governor's office in Maryland as the chief innovation officer there. And the work that my company does is has this belief that in order for education to make the changes that they want to make, they need to use data to be able to do that. And so we've got a great group here today to kind of talk about where we as a country and people who care about education have come in the last few years in using data to benefit education, where we might be going with that stuff as well. Before we get started, can I ask, are there any teachers or former teachers in here with us? Great. Current? Anybody current? Okay. Or you've got a spouse, partner, or somebody that's a teacher, or your kid's in school? Okay. Everything about this I relate to I have a 4th grader and a 6th grader, and I learn more from them about education than I do from anywhere else. So that's me, and what I'm going to do is let these folks introduce themselves. We'll go through a couple of questions. I'll try and save 5 minutes at the end so that you guys can ask us some stuff. Maybe we'll even ask you guys some stuff. So we'll keep this as interactive. It's not a huge group, so we'll keep it as interactive and conversational as we can. So with that, let me let Ross Santy introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Ross Santy. I am the Associate Commissioner of the Administrative Data Division at the National Center for Education Statistics. To fill in on Mike's points, I am a former teacher. I am a parent of a 8th grader and a 5th grader. Had to think about that for a second. That's how deep into the world it's gotten. And we've been doing a number of things, both at Ed as an entire government agency and within NCES as a statistical agency, thinking about open data and trying to figure out some new directions for things.
Laurie?
Good morning, I'm Laurie Posner. I'm so happy to be here with you. I work with a nonprofit called Intercultural Development Research Association. We're located in San Antonio, Texas, but we work nationally. And we work with teachers, with family members, school districts, business partners to try to realize the vision of high-quality educational opportunity for all children.
Thank you. And Stefan?
Good morning. My name is Stefan Kramer. I am at the American University Library as Associate Director for Research Data Services. I'm a little bit of the odd man out on this panel, I think. I have not attended K-12 schools in this country. I don't have any kids in it, so I don't know very much about K-12. So I'm bringing the higher education perspective here with a focus on research data. And my primary job at the American University is to help the university take good care of the faculty output in terms of research data.
Yeah, and I think we'll have an interesting perspective today on, well, we'll get to this, but on what the research and academic community, how they can benefit from improvements that we make in data for education. So with that, let's kind of jump in. And I wanted to start my first question and kind of direct it to Ross, but open it up to you guys as well if you'd like to respond. But I'm curious about how you're using data these days in a way that you weren't 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. And to what extent that's changed the outcomes that you're seeing for kind of education and kids.
Sure, I'll, as I did with my intro, sort of couch my answer in 2 different sides. One is being the entirety of the U.S. Department of Education. The second being the National Center for Education Statistics. As you've probably seen, if you've looked around some of the post-secondary news in the last couple months, we recently, as education, released a new scorecard for colleges. This is sort of College Scorecard 2.0. And a lot was made about the interface and how you could go in and look things up and get into a lot of good, rich information, some of which came from the National Center for Education Statistics, some of which came from aggregated data out of our Federal Student Aid Office, and some of which actually came through partnerships with Social Security Administration and Department of Labor and some other places. And so we were able to really build a rich set of data that's all behind this interface. But the key thing that really wasn't advertised as much is that to get to your point about outcomes and success, one of the key things to that initiative was enabling use of the data. There's an API on the data. You can subscribe to that as we move forward and make updates with new years of data, or if something is discovered and we were to make a change into what we put behind the interface, any data subscriptions would automatically update. And that's really the first time the U.S. Department of Education has done something. We've had very limited APIs before. But this is the first one that really sort of was designed from the beginning as part of the product we were releasing and the solution we were putting out. We also in recent years have put together a data inventory. So if you're wondering about the various data sets we put out, the various things that we do collect from whether it be state education agencies or local school districts or post-secondary institutions, we have a data inventory now that you can go and you can search and you look at all of the studies and the different series of those studies. And some of them are research studies done out of the National Center for Education Statistics, and some of them are studies in that they are annual reports behind a grant program that we've run with state education agencies. So it's the same sort of concept. We're looking across scientific statistical collections and administrative management and to some extent compliance collections. Things like our Federal Student Aid Data Center, we've increased a lot of the output in there, and just managing the data for our own purposes isn't enough anymore. That isn't success. What are we doing? What are we using to make decisions, and then how do we put that out? I had a couple slides that due to technical error I can't get up in front of you right now, but inside NCES, and in partnership with some of the program offices, we're really trying to figure out how we can use tools, whether they be Socrata, whether it be built-in pieces to other analytic tools we've got within the department, to help us more easily and more readily visualize data and not just get a table and look at that final output of columns and rows, but actually see what's living inside the data that might not immediately pop out of a table. That's one of those things I would say the biggest changes inside the department is that recognition that you want to understand why the statewide number came out to 65%. Look at the school distribution, look at the district distribution, understand the trends happening within there. And that's something we didn't have the data to do 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We had that one answer, or we had what came out of a sample survey that might tell us about a subset of schools, but if that sample wasn't representative within each state, you really couldn't make decisions from that. And so that's really where we've sort of understanding what's below the surface and helping get that out into the public hands, I think, are the biggest things that I've seen at the Department of Education.
How many of you guys have seen the College Scorecard website that came out a month or so ago? And what's the first thing you did when you pulled it up? You downloaded the data set? Look for your school? Yeah, I did all of those things, yeah. You can look up your major, right? You can look up the schools that you didn't get into. It's a lot of fun. So let me move on to another question. So Stefan especially comes to this from an interesting perspective of kind of academic research that's benefiting education. I wanted to ask, you would ask for me to ask this question, I think it was a great one, which is, what do you need from the open data community as a researcher, as an academic, to be able for you to get kind of full value out of what they're producing?
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to get the research data license?
Yeah.
So there is a model of the data lifecycle that was originally created with research data in mind, meaning data created at universities or other research institutions. But I think it largely also applies to data coming out of government agencies. And this is the conceptualization at the beginning of the life cycle, and then it goes all the way through the number crunching and data publishing and archiving. And then there's that bridge there of metadata, which allows the next researcher to find and discover that existing data set. And I think that metadata bridge is very important, because researchers often want to or need to compare data sets from different places about different institutions, about different individuals. And so they're looking to find data very often for specific geographies and specific time periods. So they need to be able to search for data by county, by zip code, by congressional district, what have you. And for very specific time periods, they need data collected at least at an annual frequency for 1970 to the present. And so it is, for that reason, it's very important that the metadata that describes data sets in data repositories carry all that information about the data sets. If you just find a data set about potholes and you download that, and then nothing with a data set will tell you how was this data collected, how often is it collected, what time period does this cover, or what area, then as a researcher you may not be able to make much use of that data. So that's one important part. The other important part is for researchers to be able to cite the data that they found. Just the way they cite any other piece of literature. And for that to happen, I think research data or any data repositories, platforms need to ideally provide a citation for that data that allows a researcher, especially students are bad at this, to uniquely quote a particular data set. And for that, it's very good if a data set has a globally unique persistent identifier. How many of you heard of DOIs, or digital object identifiers? Okay, a couple. So that's typically found on journal articles. They get a DOI, and that always identifies that journal article among all the journal articles in the world. And for that to be available for data sets would be ideal as well. So I think those are the two important elements.
That's great, and I appreciate you asking to have that question asked. And you know, sometimes I fall into this trap when I think about open data. I think about it from my mom's perspective usually, and like how this is useful to her. But we also realize that there is a community of people who have standards and like an expectation of kind of rigor and need to be able to defend stuff. I was thinking to Jonathan Schwarber yesterday, who kind of closed us out. And he was talking about trying to get all of this information down to the one visualization. And I've done that before, and I agree with him completely. There's a ton of pressure on you when you're creating that to make sure that all of the stuff behind it is good. And I assume that there's a similar kind of pressure on you when you want to use this stuff to make sure that the stuff that you are using for your analysis is good. And so I appreciate that question. Ross, did you have anything that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I want to kind of clarify one of the things that was the most important driving factors behind our creation of a data inventory was all of that metadata. What are the cycles? How far afield was the scope of that collection, and getting that information into something that had a standard structure to it could be utilized by researchers. And the flip side, which you bring up, not the flip side, the additional point that feeds back on things we're doing differently now than we were before. As of dates have become critically important, especially when we're putting out a data set. Because we know anybody who's going to go and look at that, if we're going to say we use this data set to arrive at this conclusion, whether it's a policy office or a program office making a guidance or a regulatory decision, they need to be able to say, we looked at this data from this collection as of this date, because so many of these pieces of data are in play at all times. And if that's happening and the data are changing, it does make formal research sometimes very challenging. It makes providing the evidence base for a policy or program decision very challenging. And so as of dates have become critically important to how we describe our data and how it's being used.
Great. So I wanted to ask Laurie and go in a slightly different direction, but you're doing really interesting work out of Texas, but doing it nationally. And part of the open data movement is about democratizing information. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how families and communities are starting to use data about education, about schools, to have a bigger impact on their kids or communities.
Sure. And if you have a moment to bring up the slides, I have a couple of slides just to try to help illustrate this. Two stories really about how community members and families are using data, along with in partnership with educators, and particularly as our session is focused on transformation, and community members and family members can be a driving and transformational force in partnership with schools. Just to mention that, unfortunately, in much of the formulation has family members and the public in a kind of passive role with respect to transformation of schools, and we're really trying to flip that equation and assure that family members have the resources they need and community members to play a key role in school transformation. So just as an example, in 2011, the state of Texas legislature as many legislatures around the country, chose to cut public education funding pretty significantly by about $5.4 billion, with leaving the rainy day fund untapped in Texas, which was available for that kind of purpose. And at that time, the state was, ranking about 43rd in per pupil spending. While we serve as a state a majority of low-income students and a large number of English language learners. So, one of the resources that we published in terms of data and made available is, cuts for the biennium by school district that was searchable in the map. And you see it's just kind of a rudimentary map there. But, using a Google map, which now in the session this morning would be a really great kind of deployment in a Socrata interface. Would love to be able to use that. But just, publishing how do funding cuts that are proposed and then turn out to be enacted impact school districts across the state. And at the same time, we developed a tool so that community members could give feedback, basically act as citizen journalists or reporters on how those funding cuts were specifically affecting them at the local level. We found stories from around the state, for example, our campus lost 2 classroom teachers at the pre-K level, a community member in San Antonio shared. Our Board of Trustees had to close 11 schools to close their budget gap. And, we already had a very tight student counselor ratio, and now we've lost another counselor, and the counseling positions can be really crucial because it's really the lived experience of the student that, is affected here. Buses make fewer stops. A lot of schools tried to avoid cutting programs, but needed to cut bus routes. And in low-income communities in Texas, where they're very rural, there's no street lights in some of these areas, they're unincorporated. Students have a long way to walk home, without street lights and without pavement. And so cutting the bus line can really be cutting a lifeline for parents. So there was in 2013 a restoration of about 2/3 of that funding, in part due to the speaking out by school districts, by community members. That's indispensable in terms of restoration. Of course, the funding's not equalized now. The state of Texas is actually in the midst of a lawsuit that's been brought against the state, finding the school system, the funding, unconstitutional. But the voice of families and communities is really crucial. If you could go to the next slide, please, Mike. The second story I just wanted to share with you very quickly, in a subsequent legislative session, there was a change from the required curriculum for graduation for students from what was considered a 4x4 curriculum that over 80%, about 86% of students participated in. And for those who participated, assured that they would at least have minimum preparation for college if they chose to go. They would at least meet the requirements to attend college. By changing to an endorsement approach, the state reintroduced the possibility of tracking, because there was no new allocation for school districts, to make sure that they had rigorous tracking opportunities, rigorous endorsement opportunities for students. So the risk of tracking students in lower level courses really does, the specter of that raises its head. Community members have been speaking out. This is an ongoing issue, a story that is live today and active. And they're using data to communicate what they feel is needed to make sure that their students are prepared for college. So for example, Lourdes Flores, who's on the right of the slide to you, she's a community leader who took to the airwaves to speak out about why high quality curriculum is needed to, at minimum, make sure that all children are ready for college if they choose to attend. And the survey that's referred to on the left, the survey findings, that was produced by, as you can see, with a clipboard. Promotoras are going house to house to gather and community to community to gather information from families on whether they have information on how to help their children navigate these new curriculum requirements. So, in analyzing the data from that parent survey and making sure that the information is available on those curriculum requirements, we're helping to assure that students can navigate the new curriculum in Texas, but also to give feedback to policymakers to inform their implementation of this policy.
Great. Was there another slide?
There is simply just the important role that students play as well in this work. We have, in many cases, worked with student leaders, and in this case, this is in South Texas, in a gathering called Ya es Tiempo, It's already time, it's past time that we make change in terms of education, and youth really can lead the way, especially in the case of these youth techies, which is a role of youth, using technology to create a bridge between their schools, the policies that impact education, and assuring a high-quality education for all.
So thank you, and let me just take a quick risk here and ask you guys out there, do you know of community groups or people in your community or families that are using open education data in an interesting way that you'd share with us? Yeah.
I mean, I know the state of Virginia has like their open data portal and they have apps for VA, and so it's anybody can create an app. It's kind of an open development competition.
Right.
I'm not that super familiar with how it's used,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that their goal was to get communities involved in creating apps that met their own needs through the open education data.
Oh, cool. Anybody else? Yeah.
So in Connecticut, we have a publication called the Connecticut Mirror, and they do exclusively political sort of reporting. And they developed a Your School tool, and what it really does that's interesting is not only evaluate sort of academic achievements, so test scores and things like that, but do they have recess? How long is it? What are the staffing levels? So different things, so you can compare two different schools, not strictly on test scores and things of that nature. So I would encourage you to check it out.
Yeah, I'd like that. And can I ask on something like recess, is that stuff that gets reported to a school system and it's like that information exists officially, or is that sort of crowdsourced kind of stuff?
I believe in Connecticut, it's all reported to our State Department of Education.
Okay.
It's the caveat of the Chief Data Officer of the State of Connecticut.
Right.
They did have to FOIA a bunch of that data.
Yeah.
So it's not totally open, but we're working on that.
Sure.
But it is all coming from our State Department of Education.
Oh, that's great. And one more? Was there one more? All right, we can move on. So I'll throw this out to whoever wants to jump at it first, but we're moving forward. Education is an industry that is, I think, changing dramatically, and that is only the pace of which is only going to increase. What are the barriers to, I would say, data being more useful in the improvement of education?
I'd be happy to speak to that.
Yeah, please.
One thing is that, as all of us know who are involved in this work, transformation of education is a holistic, it's comprehensive, requires a comprehensive approach. And so one of the barriers, is what we were talking about so much yesterday at the summit, which is siloing, and both siloing of roles and the way that people interact with one another, which can happen because we just don't reach out to one another and connect, and sort of the barriers and biases that are built in. And so that's one thing. Also, just the ability to connect the dots and sort of tell a comprehensive story about what's going on in education, and that at the same time is a tool to transformation, is being able to connect the dots across one area of work to another. And a third thing I would just mention is heading toward privatization. Keeping the public in public education is really crucial if we're looking to transform education, to make sure that everyone is involved, and data plays a key role in making sure that there's open, transparent communication about how schools are doing, the role that everyone can play. With a privatizing approach, we trend toward textbooks that are not validated against history, for example, which is really needed. Testing processes that kind of run amok because they're driven not by what's needed in terms of information, but driven by revenues. And so really keeping the public in public education is a key to address those barriers.
That's great. Stefan?
I would say as far as data that is collected by academics is concerned, the very availability of such data, whether it's about education or any other subject for that matter, there is a problem with the carrots and sticks behind that. And that is many funding agencies now require data management plans from researchers, which will describe how they make data available when they're done with their research project. But that's really, I think, regarded by researchers just as an administrative burden imposed on them. The reward system of universities rewards researchers for publishing in peer-reviewed journals, for publishing books, etc. It does not reward them for the most part for sharing their data, for documenting their data and making it available. So I think in higher education that has to change so that there are rewards given to researchers after they spend often taxpayers' money and collect data and crunch the numbers, that they make that available, not just because the funding agency requires it, but also because their own university wants them to do that.
Right, and I'll just mention, and I think it's been said or alluded to, but privacy and privacy concerns about personally identifiable information, all those kind of things, I think huge barrier for us as we go forward. Not that that barrier should be eliminated by just kind of sharing how my kid did on his test yesterday, but I just think that there's both kind of a political barrier there, there's a technological barrier, so that's an interesting one that we'll deal with. So my last question, and then I want you guys to have a chance to ask these guys while we're here. My last one, which nobody really is excited about getting, but so imagine 10 years from now, and that public education in the United States has been kind of dramatically transformed for the better. So the outcomes we're getting, our students' achievement, college acceptance rates, all these kind of things have improved dramatically. In that 2025, what role do you imagine data, and most particularly open data, could have had in that transformation? And I'll let somebody jump in.
I'll start us off. And I'll combine something from the last question, because as you were getting at barriers. There's points in the education process that they're not easy to collect data necessarily, but data are generated at that point. Kids get test scores. Somebody is present in school or not present in school. And so there are points, and the systems are evolving to gather and capture these things. How easily are they moved along to the next point, whether that's from a school teacher, individual teacher to the principal to know who's there that day, or from a school building to a district to understand where the curriculum seems to be registering with kids and they're showing success versus where they're not, and on up. But along all of that, and I think we will continue as an industry to make that process more efficient, but it doesn't answer all the questions we would need to get to the point you're describing where we've really accomplished something different. Because if you find a point in any set of data and you understand a school is significantly outperforming expectations based upon demographics at that school, based upon the resource mix present at that school, there's most likely no information readily available about how they did that. You got to the point of recess and the question of, was that something you reported or did you have to go get that? So how do we build whether it's crowdsourcing, whether it's some other open data solution that way, so that the information about what happened in a school, in a classroom, that made a transformational difference isn't only discovered after a 3-year research project or something along those lines. Those are still critically important to really deeply understand whether something's scalable or not scalable. But that's the other side of this. We can sort of see the outcomes more readily these days, and I think we're doing a better and better job. Have to keep privacy at the forefront of making sure we put the right data out there in a way that doesn't violate anybody's privacy. But once you have that out there, right now, it's enabling a whole better set of questions. If we've really transformed something by 2025, we've probably found a way to get data that helps answer those questions into the public mix as well, and not just the sort of outcome and event data of education.
That's great. Laurie?
I agree, and the focus on answering questions together, I think that what open data, one of the promises is that it can help to break down the barriers that we now reify as those of us who are actors and those of us who are acted upon. And I think in the transformation of education, it's really removing that sense of polarization and looking together at what's going on, and using open data can do that, because we're both producing ways of narratives and looking at the information, but we're also consuming it at the same time. So I think promoting collaborative problem solving is really what's going to be game-changing in terms of education. Using the process, as Ross indicated, of asking questions to find solutions together, tell stories about what's working, communicate very quickly scale up what's working from a local to a national perspective and share the successes with one another.
That's great, thank you. And Stefan?
What will change, which has already begun a few years ago, is that students in colleges, but perhaps then also in high schools, will increasingly become consumers of data, if you will. There are more and more requirements for quantitative methods, for empirical research among undergraduates. And I think the more data is available on subjects that are of interest to students, that they can readily access and download without having to know a statistical analysis package, that will make them better empirical researchers much earlier in life than was the case in the past.
That's great. Thank you. So, yes, in the back.
Yeah, so my question is, especially in education, a lot of the decision-making and policy changes on the local level are going to be citizen groups that aren't necessarily advocates, but they're civil groups, commission boards, things like that. And they'd probably be the most active, a major user of generating the news, and it's highly localized, so it's not really on a national level, and not really like better community. So how is actually this work being helped push to those types of groups, since those are the individuals that want to engage with this type of thing?
Anybody want to take that one?
I mean, I think that there, ideally there's an interaction, and that's kind of what you, I think, are suggesting, because, there really is a synergistic relationship between what happens at the federal level and also what happens both state and then locally. I'm really excited about the data sets that are going to be available across the country that we can share with one another. I think that those kinds of tools that allow us to, those of us that are working, locally, state, regional, national, can be exchanging not only information but also best practices, will hopefully kind of break down the idea of there being a barrier between the local and the national in terms of information sharing. I think in the best of worlds, we can be a little bit more simultaneous about that, both having a local view of a data set and at the same time keeping it in context with comparisons that are state, regional, and national, and also sliced in different ways by, for example, schools that are similarly situated, being able to compare what's going on with other schools that could be similar.
That's great. So I timed this perfectly. We've got about maybe 2.5 minutes left. We've already got one question in, but we've got smart panelists. We've got a smart audience. And so if somebody wants to ask a question, please.
Drew Mingle, I'm from Utah. I was our principal developer, designer, and architect of our statewide longitudinal data system. We match with the unemployment insurance wage file, and we are RISC-2 and FedEx enabled. I've since left the education domain and was hired by our state legislature to do the same thing I did in education, but this time with all open data in the state. There is no incentive for higher ed institutions that offer four-year degrees that don't lead to employment for them to provide me with the data that I know is there because I built the system. When are you going to get SIP level data with college scorecard? That stuff is great. Everyone should download that for their state and they should look at that. That is an unbelievably rich set of data. So I want to know, SIPs, or can you drill down by credentialing level? Certificate, 2-year, because I didn't see that. I saw the SIPs, which you're going to supposedly get eventually down the road. So if you could maybe tell us what's going on.
Ross, I think that's you.
I think so too. I don't have all the plans for the scorecard. That is not centered and rooted within NCS. That is actually a project that pulled together multiple agencies and was really driven by a number of folks in the White House and in other places to sort of pull that together. And I literally just yesterday saw some email traffic about, all right, what about the scorecard in the next couple years and the next iterations of things? So yes, things have been designed to get at the SIPs and not quite down to the certificate and other levels. We had a technical review panel last week for the IPEDS collection, which is sort of the administrative records collection across post-secondary from each institution, talking about, certificate awards and 2-year programs versus, is anything really a 2-year school or a 4-year school anymore? And, it really was driving a lot of these questions that you can't just talk about the institution. You really do need to understand something deeper. So the conversation has absolutely started. It's not just out where you are. It is here in Washington. And when will we get to something? I don't have a concrete answer. I can tell you that lots of people, having recognized the power of the data we've already put out, have seen the potential of additional levels of disaggregation and breakdown and some other things. So I think you will see a continued evolution in that area. Is it going to be legislative to the point that there is some sort of either an incentive or a consequence for hoping to help people put it forward or not putting it forward? That's a congressional discussion, and there's a lot of other things going on right now. But I think you will see where we can do it. More things coming about the outcomes. We've got new components in the iPad survey about outcome measures and some other things that may lead to a better discussion. Not everything you're getting at, but at least a step down the road. And it'll be interesting to see which states are putting incentives in place to get to what you're talking about and what steps they're taking with institutions, some of which are public, some of which are private, and what they can do inside the state. So I think the conversation is well underway, but it'll be interesting to see how the public can help inform it and guide it versus where it goes in some of its traditional pathways.
So, and I really appreciate that question, because if you guys hadn't asked any questions, one of the things I was going to ask you was, what is the one kind of piece of data that you'd love to see coming out of education? And that's sort of an example of one. So with that, I think we're out of time. Let's say thanks to the 3 panelists. And if you see them around Ross, Laurie, or Stefan later, you can tell them great job, and then you can also sort of attack them with any questions that you've had unanswered today. So thank you for joining us.